Good afternoon, everybody. Russell Holden with Render Plus Software, coming to you today from colorful Colorado. It's 2 o'clock, the top of the hour. Let's begin discussing adding lighting to SketchUp models. I have a few things to share with you before we get started. I'm going to leave this up for maybe 15 seconds. There are times when people have difficulty with the audio portion of the broadcast. Maybe their speakers don't work. So anyone who discovers that they're not getting any audio, let's give them just a minute to see if they can dial in to participate in the audio portion of this broadcast. At Render Plus Software, we have lots of resources that we publish to help you develop expertise with our software. One of them is the Render Plus channel on YouTube. You'll find lots of very helpful videos. Some of them are produced by Render Plus, but even more important maybe is that there are videos produced by end users. And sometimes end users have very interesting ways of using our rendering software. I'm sure that you would learn a lot. You might want to consider bookmarking the Render Plus Systems channel on YouTube. And of course, you'll also find renderplus.com to be an invaluable resource for learning about our software. You'll find links to video tutorials. We also have written tutorials and online documentation that is available to help you learn more about Render Plus software. You know, sometimes when you start SketchUp, the iRender Next toolbar may not install automatically. If that's the case, click on Extensions and look for iRender Next Load. Click that, and when you do, our toolbar is going to appear. It looks like this. For those of you new to this software, I do want to point out that typically our toolbar is going to load to the right of the SketchUp toolbar. I pull it away as a matter of habit. You can certainly do the same. Peel it out of the top toolbar and move it anywhere on the screen that you want. So let's start talking about lighting. You'll notice that on the screen is a nice little beach cottage. This actually is pulled directly from the 3D warehouse. We haven't done anything really to alter this model, and as soon as the model loads, what I like to do is assume that the model is ready to render, and so click the render button. When I do, this dialog appears. Now here's our first lighting topic. You'll notice across the top of this dialog, there are 5 little pictures. These are natural lighting presets. When I say natural lighting, I mean the SketchUp sun and also the SketchUp sky, both of which are used to illuminate the model. Now, the 3 pictures in the middle are pretty easy to understand. These are about managing the SketchUp sun. The 2 pictures on the outside are maybe not so obvious, so I thought I might spend a minute describing the benefits, for example, of studio high dynamic lighting. Here's the concept. If you were to take your model to a photographer's studio, the photographer would position lighting around your model, and with a combination of filters and other really nice things, create for you very nice professional photographs of your model. Studio high dynamic lighting emulates this exactly. And so if we use studio high dynamic lighting and then render our model, here is the rendering that we get. You'll notice that the shadows on this model are present and pretty subtle. I'm going to show you another rendering that makes studio high dynamic lighting even easier to understand. This is a little table model, and you'll notice underneath this table there are lots of shadows, not just a sun shadow. Studio high dynamic lighting uses multiple points of light to illuminate a model. And you'll notice on the top of this table, it may not be obvious, but the lighting solution is as though the sun were shining down on the model through a canopy of trees. The benefit is that, in particular with this table, I have the wood material sampled with direct bright light, with filtered light through this canopy of trees, and then also in shadow. So I get a very nice idea of how the materials on my model are going to sample under virtually any lighting condition. It's a very quick light solution to establish. Click Studio High Dynamic and then click Render. Now, as I mentioned, the ones in the middle are certainly a lot more obvious. Exterior with sun means that the SketchUp sun is going to be used to illuminate the model. Now, we also get illumination from the SketchUp sky. That's the clear blue sky in the background. This is our rendering of the SketchUp sky. You'll notice, for example, very nice shadows created by the SketchUp sun position. Interesting as well is notice underneath this overhang, very dark where the sun is casting a shadow, but then getting lighter as we move down the wall. Again, that's because the sun and the sky are being used to illuminate this model. You'll also notice that these windows are reflecting the blue from the SketchUp sky. I'm going to make that a little bit more interesting here in just a minute. Now, lighting presets can be selected at any time. And so this is going to be kind of an unusual thing to do. But what I want to point out is that even though our current scene is an exterior scene, and so exterior with sun is probably obvious, it is possible to select interior with no sun, and the software will not fail to generate a rendering. Of course, the rendering is going to be a little bit surprising, because as soon as we turn off the sun, you'll notice the sky is also not turned on, and so we don't get a very impressive rendering. However, it is important to point out the software did not fail to generate a completed rendering for us. So at any time we select a lighting preset, it is also possible to change specific settings. Notice, for example, that none of the presets are selected, and that's because I selected interior no sun, immediately brought back the dialog, and then clicked sky. So now there's a check mark beside sky. The lighting solution for my perspective exterior rendering is now going to be completely determined by the brightness of the SketchUp sky. Here's the rendering. Notice that all sides of this model are illuminated. That's for two reasons. Multiple light sources are being selected from the SketchUp sky, and additionally, light is bouncing off of surfaces to illuminate other surfaces in the model. Without the SketchUp sun being used, the illumination and the shading on this wall is even more interesting. Notice again that it's very dark up near this soffit, and then the wall is more illuminated as we move down the wall. You're able to select a lighting preset and then modify individual attributes of that lighting preset to generate your rendering. Lighting presets, therefore, are really just a good starting place to establish some lighting in order to create a rendering of your model. Here's another one that maybe is not so obvious. Some of you probably by now have some experience using high dynamic range images, but maybe there are plenty of you who don't. A high dynamic range image can be used to both illuminate your SketchUp model and can also be used as a background for your image. iRender Next comes with quite a few very interesting pre-packaged HDR images, and one of them that I like in particular is a sunset image. When we click on sunset image, the next thing that we might want to do is click on the magnifying glass, because what this is going to allow us to do is rotate the image, spin it around our model, so that we can place this setting sun in a location that will make for a very interesting rendering. All I do is use the slider bar and in using the slider bar, reorient the sun. And now, when we render the image, we get a completely different and very interesting rendering of our model. We're not getting a blue sky reflection any longer. We're getting reflections of the cloudy sky. You'll also notice, and I'm going to put two renderings side by side so that you can see what the effect of a setting red sun has on your model. On the left is the original rendering using the SketchUp sky only to illuminate our model. So the rendering is neutral, even maybe a little bit cool from the color of the SketchUp sky. Using the sunset HDR image has a completely different effect. The setting sun is, of course, very red, and so the result is a much warmer rendering of our project. Now, when we selected HDR image and selected one of the available images from the iRender Next image library, the only thing being used to illuminate our model was the HDR image. Once again, I'm going to add to that by clicking on Sun. The reason that HDR is no longer selected is because when the sun is checked, the definition of HDRI sky and background preset is no longer met. And so that will be unselected. However, the HDRI image is still being used as a background. It's still being used to illuminate the model with now the addition of the SketchUp sun. So now I have sun shadows in addition to the really nice illumination of the model and still the very warm colors because of the HDR image that I'm using. Use a lighting preset. Make any changes that you want. iRender Next will not fail to render a very nice image for you. Now, let's add some artificial lighting to this model. When I click on the chandelier, I get the Render Ready Components dialog. This is a very nice library of light fixtures that are ready to render. So I've selected this classic wall. I'm actually going to use this as a porch lamp. There it is placed on the porch. Now I'm going to take a look at the rendering settings. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to unselect the sun. You'll notice that when I do that, now the criteria or the definition of HDRI sky and background preset is matched again. You'll remember the only change that I made was I selected the sun. So when I unselect it, we're now back to meeting the definition of the HDR preset. And so when I render the image, I get a very nice rendered image now with a porch light turned on. Now, when we click on the porch light, this is right-clicking on the porch light to select it. I want to make a change. That porch light was actually very white, which is the default color. And so what I'd like to do is I would like to change that. I'm going to set the color to more orange. There's very little artificial lighting that is truly white. Incandescent bulbs, for example, are considerably warmer, and so by increasing the red value, and that means lowering green and blue to make the light more red, I'm going to get a rendering of this lighting that is a little bit more correct if an incandescent bulb is installed in that fixture. Notice how much warmer that is. And again, here are the two side by side. Now, both of these renderings were rendered with the HDR image. The image on the left is the default color for the bulb in the porch light. The image on the right is a modified color to make that bulb look more like an incandescent light. iRenderNext includes a light balancing interface that we call lighting channels. If you're a designer, you're going to love the ability to balance lighting once your rendering is completed. And I want to point out that we're going to do this. We're going to balance some lighting without having to return to SketchUp. I have pre-populated this model with garden lighting and also some recessed lighting, which is under the overhang. Because they are unchecked just like the sun, that means that these lights are switched off. These values indicate the brightness of those lights when they're switched on. We can check the lighting to switch them on. You'll notice immediately that the garden lights turned on. Additionally, these 3 recessed can lights that I put underneath this overhang are now turned on as well. This is quite interesting because I'm able to process one rendering, both a daytime rendering, and then by using the lighting channels interface, which is enabled when you click the light bulb icon, I'm able to take the same rendering and from the completed rendering create an additional presentation image of a dusk image of my model. I wanted to show you this image because it's very important for you to understand that when you illuminate a model with light, the light is directly illuminating surfaces, as in the case of this wall. This is just a very simple little spotlight pointed at the wall, and it is the only light being used to illuminate this model. There is no sun, there is no sky, one light hanging from the ceiling. And yet, even the back side of this column, you'll notice it's not black. It is admittedly dark. However, it's not black, and that's because the brick wall, the wall over our shoulder, and the ceiling, and the floor, and this wall in the back are all bouncing light towards this column and so illuminating it. Now, because the column is wood and somewhat dark, it is reflecting back to us less light than the white wall, but still it is being illuminated by the bounced lighting. And so if not, it would be black. So keep in mind when you illuminate your models, the direct lighting will illuminate surfaces, but also light is being bounced off of surfaces and so will illuminate other surfaces. I just wanted to show you the importance of color. Here's the light when it's completely white, and here's the light if I make it warmer by lowering the red and green values to make it more like an incandescent bulb. It's not only the addition of a light fixture, the brightness of the light, and in the case of a spotlight, establishing the cone and the spread of that light. Keep in mind in your renderings that in order to make your model look more realistic, it's not a bad idea at all to pay very close attention to the light being thrown from the bulb. When you look at these two side by side, now you're always able to make a rendering decision. And one of the rendering decisions that you will want to make is regarding the color of the light that you're using. Even very subtle changes to the color of the light will have a surprisingly nice effect on the completed rendering. So select a fixture. Set all of the values for the brightness of the fixture, and please don't ignore color. if you want your rendering to look realistic. Hopefully a lot of you are aware that any surface in your SketchUp model can behave as a light. Now you'll notice I have this very interesting tube sculpture on the wall back here. And so what I want to do is I actually want to treat that as though it were a light fixture. You'll notice it's highlighted, so I clicked on it in SketchUp. That brings up this dialog. And what we'd like to do is select Set Object Properties, which brings up this dialog. And what we're going to do is when we click the Glow tab, we are going to increase the wattage to 40 watts and then render. So now I have my spotlight illuminating the wall. I have a recessed can in the ceiling doing some nice illumination for us. And in addition, I've essentially taken a sculptural element in my SketchUp model and I'm now treating it as though it's a light. It's very interesting, the light on the floor, the brightness, the brightened area on the ceiling, and of course all around this light on the brick wall. The nice effect that we're getting by just treating this simple shape as though it were a light. Let's go back to the lighting channels dialog and kind of play around with some light balancing for a minute. The ceiling light is referring to this recessed can, and so if we lower the brightness value, look at the immediate effect on the completed rendering. This is a very important feature of iRender Next, and one that I hope you'll take advantage of frequently when your rendering is completed. Click on that light bulb, bring up the light channels dialog, and play around with balancing your lights to fine-tune your rendering. There is no need to return to SketchUp. Instead, modify the brightness of the lights. When you're satisfied, save your rendering for your client presentation or your internal design review. We have a number of other very interesting post-processing features, and again, these are accomplished with the completed rendering. No need to return to SketchUp, no need to fire up some other imaging program. You can do all of this from within your completed rendering. So for example, the tone operators include brightness, contrast, burn, and saturation. I'm sure if you've used any imaging software whatsoever, all of those terms are very familiar to you. What we're going to do is we're going to lower the saturation of color in this rendering. You know, sometimes what can make a rendering look not so realistic is how saturated the image is with color. So if we lower the saturation just a little and do nothing else, watch the column, for example, and also watch the brick wall behind. So here we are at 100% saturation. When we lower down to 70, it's quite interesting how this looks more like a photograph of the space. Again, this is a rendering decision based on what you consider to be more realistic for the image that you're going to present to your client. I was recently looking at indirect lighting because I think that's a very important thing to understand when you're using a high-end renderer and when you're making design decisions and adding lighting to your model. The only light illuminating this model is cove lighting. There are actually 10 spotlights evenly distributed around this ceiling. Those spotlights are pointed directly up at the ceiling. The bounce light off the ceiling is illuminating this model, and those are the only light fixtures in this model. So we get this really nice wash of light in the space, almost as though we had a skylight. And what's also quite nice is the very soft shadows being cast from the indirect lighting. Cove lighting is really easy to add to a SketchUp model. There are a couple of ways to do it, and one way is to right-click on a surface. In this case, you'll notice we're looking at kind of a plan view of my model. I'm right-clicking on this white surface, and when I do, I get another way of making a surface behave as a light. So we're going to set the object properties for that white surface that runs around the perimeter of this model. And what we'd like to do is we would like the rendering program to treat that surface as though it were a light. So we set the value for wattage. And then I want to show you, because I'm not sure everybody clicks on this, but it is very useful. We're going to click on the advanced lights settings. The default is that the light will be treated as omnidirectional. So it'll be treated just like a light bulb. For my purposes, I didn't want to do that, so I selected diffuse. And that means that the light is going to be thrown normal to the surface. So that's one way to, and it's actually a very fast way, to create a Cove lighting solution. In addition, what we might do is select some fixtures from the Render Ready Components dialog, and what I decided was that a spotlight would be really nice. So I select spotlight, and then I placed, again, 10 evenly distributed around the perimeter of my room. And once I do that and render, here is the rendered solution. This was rendered at fairly high resolution and rendered in about 1,000 passes. Now, no one has asked any questions, which is quite surprising. I'm hoping that although I went through this information fairly crisply, that there are a couple of conclusions you will have reached. The first is that lighting presets are for natural lighting of your SketchUp model. That means the inclusion or exclusion of the SketchUp sun. Keep in mind that when the SketchUp sky is used to illuminate your model, the SketchUp sky is multiple lights pointed at your model, not just one. That's one of the reasons that all sides of your model will be so nicely illuminated. Keep in mind as well that light is not only just direct light, it also means bounce lighting off of the surfaces in your model. And then, of course, there's the use of HDR images that will influence not only the lighting solution because a sun position is being selected, but additionally, you can have a very nice effect on the color quality of your model when you select different HDR images. Using those backgrounds is optional. You can certainly turn that off and just use an HDR image to illuminate your model, not necessarily as a background. Perhaps you have much more interesting backgrounds to put your model within the context maybe of a site or an existing streetscape. Our interface ensures that with regard to adding artificial lighting to your model, there's nothing particularly complicated about it. Notice on this dialog, for example, that once we have selected a type of light, there's not a whole lot to do except how bright is the light, that's specified as watts, specify the color of the light, any color that you want. We also have some very nice presets for warm fluorescent lighting, cool fluorescent lighting, incandescent lighting. You can also just specify the RGB value if you're aware of what the approximate value might be. And of course, there is always the opportunity to use the lighting channels dialog to balance lighting once your rendering is completed, as well as use our tone and filters to make slight adjustments to the completed rendering. I'm really grateful for your attendance today. I told you that this wouldn't take very long. If you have questions, please send them to support@renderplus.com. I'll be looking for them. I'll answer your questions as quickly as possible. And as I mentioned earlier, I have recorded this webinar, and so once we're finished, I will process the video and I will add it to our YouTube channel as quickly as possible. Visit the Render Plus Systems YouTube channel. Hopefully later today, more likely by Monday, I'll have the video published. Share it with your friends. Let's help everyone increase their skills with iRender Next. And that's going to wrap it up for me this afternoon. I don't know about you, but I've got some renderings processed, and I'd like to go see how they're doing. Hope you're having good luck with iRender Next. And until next time, by the way, check on renderplus.com. Our webinar schedule lists a couple more webinars that we'll be hosting between now and the end of August. Check back frequently on renderplus.com. As I update that webinar schedule, I keep it pretty current on our website. Hopefully, you may also have some ideas about something that you'd like to see covered in an upcoming webinar. Again, send that information to me at support@renderplus.com. Until next time, thanks for attending. I'll look for some emails and answer any questions that show up. Everybody have a great weekend. Let's go get some renderings done.